We are very happy to have you joining with us in the interview today. If it's okay for you that we will start with some question about your background first.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So we see that you started training in medicine and in psychiatry. So before joining to BMJ. So what led you join BMJ?
Well, like a lot of things, it was a bit of an accident. I didn't think, oh, I want to go and work at a medical journal. I was actually looking in the BMJ, my next post in psychiatry. It was the next level before specialist training. It was, and they said that the advertisement would be in the classified pages of the BMJ on Friday. So I looked, and it wasn't there. But what there was instead was an advertisement from the BMJ saying, why don't you come here for a year to learn about peer review, about research, and importantly about journalism, debate, and general aspects of editing. And I thought, well, it's only a year, that looks really interesting. And I had already got some experience of writing, because while I was training in psychiatry in our National Health Service, I was so moved by the the kind of suffering, and to some extent the stigma and sometimes the neglect of people with mental health problems, and the lack of information for them. So with a colleague, we thought we might write a book, a sort of user guide to mental health. And by the time I saw this advertisement for the BMJ, a big publisher, HarperCollins, had expressed interest in us writing that book for them. So I'd already started writing that and feeling the urge to communicate and to try and explain things, although of course that was to an audience of patients and the public, not to professionals, and the BMJ is largely aimed at professionals. Anyway, so I thought, well, I'll apply, I won't have much chance, and then actually genuinely to my surprise, I got offered the job. So that was a one-year internship, and I thought I would go back to psychiatry after a year. But as the year went on, it became clear that actually this was the beginning of an internship program, and there was the possibility of staying on, and indeed I got that chance. And many of us have joined through that program. We still run it, the one-year internship. It's a bit different now. It's not openly advertised. We do it now in partnership with the Department of Health, where leadership trainees have the chance to come and do their post at the BMJ. But it is still an internship. So I was the first one, and it's been running 29 years.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. And that's kind of internship that is open to students with a training in biomedicine?
Yes, but as I say, it's now linked directly to a training program in leadership for young doctors in our National Health Service in the UK. When we first started it, it was a completely sort of openly advertised post, and we did have interns from around the world. We had one from India, we had various people from across Europe. And in some ways, I'm sad to say that it has narrowed to UK only, but there are many strengths to our partnership with the leadership programme in the NHS through the Department of Health. So that's what it is. It's changed over the years, but it's built a very strong team at the BMJ. So Fiona Godley, the editor-in-chief of the BMJ, came the year after me. Kamran Abbasi, who's one of the executive editors of the BMJ, he arrived through that scheme. Many of us did, and we also have a wonderful diaspora around the world, including Jocelyn Clark, who was one of our interns, worked at the BMJ for a long time, and then went to PLOS Medicine and is now at the Lancet. And also Gavin Yamey, who is now a professor of global health at Duke University in the US, but he was also one of our interns. So, and we've all stayed connected, and it's enormously benefited the BMJ, but we hope it's also been of use more widely.
Yeah, that's very nice. And we look at your BMJ profile, and it looks like you having a lot of different positions, like being a director of academic outreach and advocacy for BMJ, editor-in-chief for BMJ Open, and honorary deputy editor, and you have a lot of activities on clinical trial, transparency, and reproducibility. So how does your typical work day look like?
Well, I'm almost never at the office. I haven't had a desk at the BMJ's headquarters in London for about 5 years. And actually, wonderfully, the BMJ has always been a really flexible organisation, which has been very open-minded and very keen to promote diversity. So I was at the BMJ full time for just a few years, and then I had a break to have 2 children, and in between and after that I came back to the BMJ part-time and was able to do a lot of work from home, which was brilliant. And of course, when you have that kind of flexibility, you often find that actually people work very long days, but they work them flexibly. So the BMJ's had a great culture on recognising that you can work from anywhere, and that what we do is an international endeavour. And over the years, that's become more and more obvious. So until about 4 or 5 years ago, I was the head of the research team at the BMJ and a deputy editor, and my team of research editors were all over the world. So very often our weekly manuscript meeting, where we decide which peer-reviewed papers to take, was entirely done by phone, with perhaps only one of us in the UK, and that one might have been me working at home. The point is, what we do is entirely global, and you can do it from anywhere if you have a decent internet connection, and a culture at work where people understand that just because they can't see you, it doesn't mean that they can't connect with you, invite you to meetings. You know, you're present even if you're not visible, and that's really important. Yeah. So what do I do now? Sorry, just to say, the last few years, 3 or 4 years, I have moved away from directly working on the BMJ. I still represent Fiona Godley, the editor, in terms of a lot of outreach, and particularly advocacy work around open science and the reproducibility of research and trying to reduce waste in research, that kind of thing. But I've also been given the chance and the resources to build a very big e-learning program for early career researchers. It was particularly aimed at researchers in low and middle income countries, but we do also have learners in Europe and more developed countries. It's called Research to Publication, and I was given the chance and the time to go away and develop and write 100 hours of e-learning, which we have matched with 100 hours from the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. So their courses are on how to plan and conduct research in health, which is of very high ethical and scientific integrity wherever you are in the world. And the BMJ courses, which I have developed and have supported with quite a lot of outreach, are around how to communicate that research at all stages, including at the protocol stage, and to do that with ethical and scientific integrity and, whenever possible, reproducibility. So I've been lucky to be able to go off and do that. And meanwhile, I'm also the editor-in-chief of BMJ Open, which is one of our other 60 journals. It's a big so-called mega journal. I was initially the very hands-on editor, but as the journal has grown and my role has changed, we now have a really brilliant day-to-day editor, Adrian Aldcroft. I'm more responsible for things like strategy and outreach, and the team comes to me if there's a very particularly pressing or tricky problem, for instance, something to do with ethics.
Yeah. And which aspect of your work that you enjoy the most?
Oh, definitely my work with the outside world. So, you know, my favourite day would be meeting authors of research, or meeting people who are doing their very best to try and make research less wasteful, higher quality. So people like you, yeah. But also, you know, something like being in Rwanda and doing a 2-day workshop with the fantastic researchers there and their local faculty on how to develop great research questions that are really truly relevant to Rwanda and its priorities for health, and making sure that the study methods and design are as good as they can be in the setting with the resources resources available, and helping them consider publishing perhaps in their own local journal, which is growing fast. So a lot of what we do is not about just trying to get great papers into our journals. It's about genuinely trying to build the capabilities and to some extent the capacity for good health research. So that's definitely my favorite kind of day.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I wanted to ask you about open peer review. So both the BMJ and BMJ Open publish research using the open peer review process. So why is this the case? What led to this decision employing this process?
Okay, well, I'm being very positive about the BMJ, but it's not just because I work there and they pay me. One of the great things about the BMJ and the whole BMJ company is willingness to try and learn from evidence and to generate evidence. So the BMJ for many, many years, 20 years or more, has had a full-time researcher within the organisation who has worked both internally with editors and other colleagues, publishing colleagues, but also importantly with external researchers such as Professor Doug Altman or John Ioannidis and others, to develop good research questions and studies to evaluate the way we appraise and disseminate research, and particularly studies around peer review. So back in the mid-90s, no, or perhaps it was even earlier than that, the BMJ just decided we were going to ask reviewers to sign their reports, to put their names and addresses and their competing interests on their reviewers' reports, because it just seemed crazy that people should be judged by, a bit like going to court and all of the jury and the judge have masks on or hoods on and you don't know who they are. It just didn't feel right or just. So we launched this, but soon after that we tested it in a randomized controlled trial, because people said that if you got reviewers to sign their peer review reports, that they would be bland. They would say, oh, it's all right, it's quite a nice paper, but they wouldn't be critical for fear of offending the authors or for fear of the authors being cross with them or criticizing them in turn or something like that. And that's been the argument against this kind of openness. So we did that, and our trial showed that there was no harm in getting reviews signed. It didn't show that reviews were of higher quality, it showed they were of the same quality. And our research team developed and validated a standardized instrument for assessing the quality of a peer reviewer's report. And one thing that was improved was the tone. When I first went to the BMJ in 1989 and everything was on paper, it was before the digital days, we used to literally cut and paste reviewers' reports. They came in as written documents. They often included insults, unnecessary, unwarranted, unprofessional insults about the authors or their work. And we literally had to sit there with a ruler, a scalpel and some glue and reassemble a reviewer's report that didn't have the insults in it. And then we would photocopy that and send it to the authors. And our trial showed that the tone was much more collegial, much more constructive and positive when people had to sign their reviews. So we then moved on to a study looking at the idea that once a paper has been peer reviewed and accepted and is published, then why not publish the peer reviewers' reports next to it, along with the original submitted version of the report, of the paper rather, and the author's responses to all of the comments they receive from the editors and the reviewers. So this is called a pre-publication history. We did this trial, but unfortunately the first author sadly got very ill and died, and there were other reasons for the publication of that study being rather slow. In the meantime, Fiona Godley, who's now the editor of the BMJ, who had been at the BMJ first as an intern and then as an assistant editor, went away to become the first editorial director of Biomed Central. And while she was there, she thought, well, I'm just going to implement here what we tested at the BMJ recently, which is this idea of open peer review with pre-publication histories once a paper has been published. And so she started that for the BMC series journals, and they still do it. So when we launched BMJ Open in 2011, for us it was a no-brainer that we would make the journal as open as possible in all ways, and that included this form of open peer review. And just lastly, now that there are organisations such as Publons, which is a web-based service which allows reviewers to list the journals for which they've reviewed, and if the reviews are open, they can actually put the reviews there with a DOI, making them citable and making sure that they can therefore get due credit for their work. We have partnered with Publons through BMJ Open, and we make it easy for reviewers who review for BMJ to also have their reviews published at Publons in a citable form. So I hope I've answered your questions. I've done it in a rather long and roundabout way, as I tend.
No, definitely.
But
definitely,
I think
fascinating.
yes, and we do continue to evaluate the impact of open peer review, and we also have founded with JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the 4 yearly congresses on scholarly peer review, the Peer Review Congress, and we just had the 8th one, so they've been going a very long time, and with JAMA we still run those congresses, and they've been an amazing experience and resource for not just looking at peer review but all kinds of evaluations, you know, original research looking at the dissemination, production and so on of scholarly information.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that, for example, the tone improved and maybe other things, but did you come across challenges as well with this process?
There's one
maybe?
Yeah, well, no, not really. I mean, we've always had a system of kind of gathering any complaints, and they are few and far between, and there are occasionally things like, look, I'm in a field which is quite small and competitive in my country, and it's likely that I'll be competing for grants with the people whose work you will ask me to review. So look, I won't review papers from my own country, but I'll happily review them from somewhere else. That's the kind of response we've had. We do have a few people who just say, no way am I going to review under this system. But the one documented slight disadvantage which has been shown in other studies is that the already quite high refusal rate by reviewers, you know, it's quite common for about, it's pretty standard, about 30% of reviewers either say no or simply don't reply when you invite them to review a paper. That's been shown in lots of studies, and our studies of open peer review and a few other studies of open peer review have suggested that that rate is slightly higher, maybe 33%, maybe as much as 35%, but that's a price we're very willing to pay.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, we can move on to the next question about the data sharing. So I think that like in BMJ that you require authors of trials to make the anonymized data available on request. However, recent research also published on BMJ shows that the data availability is not optimal, even in the journals that have a very strong policy on data sharing. So in your opinion, what is the role of the journal in this case?
Yes, well, in English we talk about carrots and sticks. They're different kinds of incentives. You have to imagine a donkey who you either get to move along by hitting them with a stick, or you dangle a carrot in front of them. And we've always tried both things, really. There was a lot of debate, particularly about clinical trials. I just want to make it clear that on the whole, these initiatives are about sharing the individual participant data which has been de-identified, and that's the data from clinical trials. There is also, you know, there are good arguments for sharing the data from any study, particularly large observational studies, which might be quite influential on things like health policy. But as yet, there are no mandates around that. All the mandates are about trials, and there are good reasons for that, because when people enter a clinical trial, they're actively, altruistically joining a study where they might be at extra benefit or risk, depending on which group they're randomized to. You know, you take people and you actively do stuff to them in order to answer a research question. That's a big deal. And trials are expensive and difficult to do. They're nearly always funded with public money, or, you know, sure, they're even if they're done by the pharmaceutical or devices industry, they're done in public facilities, of course, with financial support from industry. But even so, we're talking about real people taking their time and pushing themselves at potentially some risk to enter these trials. And therefore, it's imperative that we get as much information as possible out of those trials. And we don't think it's okay for a paper of 3,000 words in a top journal to be the only output from a trial. That's pretty crazy. That's like a selfie of a study. It's not the study. So there are all sorts of good reasons for sharing the data. So what have we done over the years? Well, we've done a mixture of things. We've done a lot of both research publication and advocacy and investigative journalism about the case for data sharing from clinical trials, showing that the evidence base is very badly skewed. There has been massive publication bias. There has been deliberate suppression of results that are disappointing or unable to support the hypothesis. So we've done a lot of that. We hope we've also done a lot of positive advocacy, for instance, by co-founding the All Trials Initiative along with Ben Goldacre and other organisations such as Cochrane. And I say also publishing a lot of original research showing the need for data sharing and a lot of discussion and debate on how to do it best. We've done a lot of advocacy, getting involved in international groups. So I've recently been part of a Europe-wide EU-funded project called Corbel Ecrin, or Ecrin, to try and work out the practicalities of sharing clinical trial data. And we just published that paper in BMJ, and by the way, I had nothing to do with the peer review of that. So there are lots of ways we've tried to do this, but obviously also our own policies. So while we've been doing all that, we've been thinking, well, what should we do? And we started at the BMJ back in 2009 saying that all authors of any kind of research paper must include a data sharing statement on their paper. Even if the data sharing statement says no further data are available, that's explicit and it's made the authors think about it. After a few years, we thought, look, we can't wait for the rest of the world to decide what to do about clinical trial data sharing, so we'll introduce our own policy. And our own policy was that we would ask people, authors of clinical trials, to promise on submission of their trial that they would share the IPD, the individual participant data, on reasonable request. And we did it like that because what we wanted to do was to make people think and to provide a forum for debate, so that if the authors refused when somebody came along and asked for the data set, at the very least we would then expect the people requesting access to come and send an e-letter to the paper and say, we tried, this was our hypothesis, our research question, the authors said no. We'd then get the authors along to defend themselves and so on. We wanted to push the debate forward. Actually, most people just said, all right, we'll do it. But since then, there have been two studies, one in BMJ Open and one in the BMJ, interviewing or surveying authors who have published in the BMJ. And one of the studies also looked at PLOS Medicine and trying to get them to share the data. And the first study was quite disappointing, and people were quite resistant quite often to not, saying they didn't want to share their data set. To be fair, though, if you're clinical trialists and it's going to take you maybe 2 or 3 weeks and quite a lot of money to prepare the data set for sharing, and the only reason for sharing is because these guys are doing a survey, they don't want to use the data set, I can see why people might go, actually, no, that's not a real request. The second study, which was published more recently, looking at the BMJ and PLOS Medicine, showed much better rates, which is extremely encouraging. And of course, that's partly because this bandwagon is rolling along in the background on its own. If you talk to clinical trialists, that many of them will say, oh gosh, yes, actually, we've been doing this ad hoc for years. Cochrane reviewers or other people come to us and say, we've got a good use for your data set, will you share it? And of course we do. And many clinical trials teams are already doing this, and what's nice is that we're now shifting to a world where this happens up front and funders are willing to fund the proper preparation and deposition of an anonymized data set. And meanwhile, we're getting places where it's possible to share data safely. The idea that these data sets ought to be entirely out in the open web has kind of faded over time. That might work for a basic science data set, but it's rarely okay for a clinical data set where it's possible that patients might still be identifiable even with all the safeguards. So what we've now got is the development of platforms where researchers have to put in a proposal for a secondary study with a proper research question, a proper design, and that is assessed by an independent peer review committee, and then they're given access if their proposal seems valid. So all of that is happening. Meanwhile, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which is just a bunch of editors meeting once a year, largely from the top medical journals, but also from other important partners who join ICMJ for a few years' time. So that includes some African journals and journals from around the world. Anyway, this body has over the years developed the uniform requirements for biomedical manuscripts, which are now called recommendations, and they have rather slowly, but perhaps understandably slowly, come up with a data sharing policy, which has now kicked in. And so from next year, any trials submitted to those journals, and that includes the New England Journal of New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the BMJ, PLOS Medicine, and so on, will have to have registered a data sharing plan on the clinical trial registry up front, and then when they submit the paper they'll have to comply with their plan or say why they didn't. So as an ICMJE member journal, we will of course be implementing that policy, which will supersede our existing policy of data sharing on request. Sorry, another very long answer.
Yeah, no, but it's very interesting to hear all of that, all the initiatives that you have been trying to do to make the data sharing be doable for people. Yeah, so I think we can move on to the next question about so in MiRoR projects that we are very interested in questionable research practice, and we are currently doing a project to explore the attitude of researcher about questionable research practice. So in your opinion, what do you think about questionable research practice, and how the views about this issue have changed over time?
Yes, well, I think one of the biggest things is that for years we thought that research misconduct only meant certain things. We thought it meant doing unethical studies, number one, but then we thought it meant the three things: fraud, fabrication, and plagiarism. And the most attention was paid to fraud and plagiarism. Plagiarism is, common. The internet makes it more possible, but actually it also makes it more detectable. And lots of journals use anti-plagiarism software, which actually is more powerful than just something like Turnitin, because it can actually crawl the data, the massive Crossref database of published papers, which are behind journal paywalls and therefore not accessible by things like Turnitin. So plagiarism's common, but we're sort of on the case. Fraud is terrible when it happens. It's shocking when it happens, but it's probably more common than we think, but generally nobody dies. Fabrication, we used to think, was sort of part of fraud, it was kind of making up your data because you were fraudulent. But no, the biggest shift is we've realized that data manipulation and fabrication are absolutely rife, and they're embedded in the research culture, and even researchers in the very best funded research institutions around the world think it's okay to not report outcomes because they think, oh, actually it didn't turn out how we thought, it doesn't fit with our clinical view, or oh, something must have gone wrong, so we'll say that actually this was our primary outcome, not that, in a trial. And as you'll know, things like Ben Goldacre's project, what was it called? I've completely forgotten what it was called. But the recent project where they looked at clinical trials published in the top 5 medical journals and compared the outcomes that were reported in the published papers with the outcomes that were at the clinical trial registries and in the protocols, and they found a lot of switching of outcomes with no explanation. And we now know that that kind of it is misconduct, but it hasn't been recognized as misconduct, is terribly common, and that's the stuff that kills patients, because that's the stuff that skews the evidence base and leads to the wrong clinical practice guidelines, the wrong systematic reviews, the wrong drug policies, you name it. you know, we haven't got many examples of the toll on patients, but there are some. There are some. So what are we doing? Well, over the years, we've tried very hard to prevent this through advocacy, but also by encouraging methodological research and also encouraging sort of how to do it articles on methodology and reporting in a section we have in the BMJ called Research Methods and Reporting. So it's a whole part of the BMJ dedicated entirely to that, and we've started publishing articles like that in BMJ Open as well. Obviously, the wonderful development of reporting guidelines such as Consort, Strobe, Prisma, and many more, you know, things like Core Q for qualitative research and so on, and all gathered together at the wonderful Equator Network, have been absolutely vital to this, and we're very pleased to have been able to support those initiatives in lots of ways. We have actually provided a little bit of financial support over the years, but also importantly, I think we've provided a lot of editorial time. Many of us have been invited to take part in the Delphi exercises, the face-to-face workshops, and the reporting in final papers of such reporting guidelines, and they, you know, their benefit to medicine can't be overestimated. I mean, I often feel that Professor Doug Altman, my colleague who's the head of statistics at the BMJ, has probably done more for medicine than almost anybody else on earth. But as a statistician, he doesn't get that recognition, which we think is very sad. We have recognised him with one of our BMJ Lifetime Achievement Awards because, you know, that work is absolutely as important as any piece of clinical work. So there's all that, and we use reporting guidelines up front. We don't just use them to sort of clean up a paper once we want to publish it. It's embedded in our peer review process, and that's common now at many journals, but I think we were one of the first to do that. In fact, I know we were. And for clinical trials, people have to submit, obviously, the registration details, which we check. We don't take their word for it that they registered the study up front, you know, prospectively, and we go and read the registration details when we're appraising a submitted paper. We also ask for the protocol, the version of the protocol that was used to run the study, and we check that very carefully. Importantly, though, we also have very active post-publication peer review, which is an essential tool for highlighting and trying to fix any questionable research practices. So if we publish a paper and then our e-letters, our rapid responses on the BMJ, or our e-letters on any of our other journals, I mean, BMJ Open has published 700 e-letters in the last 5 years, although the BMJ has published 109,000 since the mid-80s. They're terribly important. Readers carefully read our papers and then come back and say, ooh, what about this? And it allows debate and allows the authors to respond, and quite often the authors to go, oh gosh, you're right, and then to publish a correction or to do some further work or to deposit the data set in a repository. That's terribly important.
Yeah. Currently, that the journal impact factors is frequently used as a surrogate measure for the quality of the individual research articles and to assess the individual scientist contributions. So do you think that the journal impact factors should play such a main role in the research evaluations?
A simple answer is no, and we're involved in quite a lot of initiatives to try and develop and roll out real measures of impact. Now, you might think, as a journal publisher, why would we do that? We should be trying to defend our, you know, our turf, you know, because impact factor is something that's good for us because our impact factors are quite good at our journals. But you know, the mission of BMJ, the publishing group, is a healthier world, to get a healthier world, and we do mean it. We actually genuinely mean it. And if individual outputs, but also institutional outputs, you know, universities and so on, are looking at the real impact of research, that has to be better for health than some not great metric. And we know there are many flaws with the calculation and the misuse of journal impact factors. So, you know, we have this thing every year in June when the impact factors come out where we'll go, oh, impact factor is a terrible thing, and we've signed the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA. We signed that several years ago. at BMJ. So we say, you know, they're a terrible thing, and then when they come out, we go, great, all our impact factors have gone up. Isn't that marvelous? So, you know, there's a bit of a tension there. But one of the reasons we kind of celebrate that when it happens, but we try not to make too much of it, is because we know it remains at the moment important to a lot of our authors, and we want to. You know, we want authors to send their best work to us, and we want to provide them with the best service we can. So there's this sort of ongoing tension. But no, absolutely, we'll all be pretty glad when impact factor is dead, I think. And we are actually working hard on how we might be able to contribute to the various movements, such as DORA, such as the Leiden Manifesto, such as the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, which is used to assess universities. It looks like China is probably going to introduce something similar for its new double first university network, which will be its top international world-beating universities. It looks like they won't take impact factor as a major key performance indicator, which is really interesting because China up until now has very much used impact factor as its main metric. So the world is changing, and we want to be part of that change. We're involved in an international group which is centered on the UK working on this, but I've also been peripherally involved with the group that the metrics team at Stanford have convened, also looking at this. So I went and took part in their workshop in the US a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Maybe so yeah. Yeah, sorry, Van. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you can keep going.
Yeah, so maybe this is just relates to the previous question. So you mentioned a lot of initiatives like data sharing or registering protocols. So all these things help to avoid waste in research. And in the MiRoR project, we're really focused on waste in research and how to avoid it. So where do you see the journals contributing to this? What other initiatives are there?
Yes, well, it's similar to my previous answers. We try at BMJ to contribute in various different ways. So we've contributed to the reward initiative. So this was the initiative set up after the publication of the really important Lancet series in 2014. There was an article in 2009 which kind of raised the issue, and then it was followed up with a series of 5 articles in 2014. And after that, there's a kind of an informal group that has continued to meet, and I'm part of that on behalf of the BMJ. Importantly, the e-learning program I mentioned that we have built, Research to Publication, absolutely addresses the waste and research agenda all the way through, making it really clear that the place you have to start is with good research questions that are actually capable of filling evidence gaps, showing that there is a gap, preferably by looking at systematic reviews, making sure that wherever possible questions are relevant to and important to patients, to the public, to society, and so on, and then crucially using the best possible methods in the circumstances, which might vary. You know, if you're in a very rural part of a low-income country, your ability to use certain methods might be you know, restricted, but then you do your very best, and then you discuss that properly and then discuss the limitations in your paper. You don't pretend everything was, you know, absolutely perfect when it wasn't, and of course that applies to any paper. So there's that advocacy, there's the teaching that we do through Research to Publication, our e-learning, and then again hopefully the things that we do during our peer review process. So importantly, we include patients in the peer review process at the BMJ, and we will soon be doing so at BMJ Open when possible. That's not for every paper, but for any paper that has a clinical research question, we try very hard to include patients in the peer review process. We have a fantastic international patient advisory panel. We have several hundred patient reviewers now on our database, and we ask them to look at questions such as, does this research question, you know, mean much to patients, or is it just something that researchers are interested in? Do you think that the study design and methods were appropriate from a patient perspective? What's the burden on patients of taking part in a study like this? And so on, questions that are like that. And we haven't managed to get patient reviewers for every eligible study, but we're working hard on it, trying to improve that. We've developed lots of resources for patient reviewers to support them and help them. And it's an extremely interesting and we think valuable initiative, but it's not easy and it takes time. And there is one other journal, there's a Biomed Central journal, which is co-edited by a patient, which includes patient review in their process, which is also great. So that's something else that's really important. And then there's everything else we try to do through the peer review process, obviously giving a lot of emphasis to methodological and statistical reviewing, and as I've already mentioned, making sure that reporting is as good as it can be, supported by the use of reporting guidelines such as the various consort extensions and so on. So I hope we're doing quite a lot. We've, as much as possible, we contribute to international conferences as well, and all sorts of initiatives. So right this very week, a consultation has opened across the EU, an online consultation called Entire, which is trying to build a sort of platform for research integrity across Europe. And I'm sure there'll be a big focus on research ethics, not doing terrible things to people in studies, but I very much intend to contribute to that by pointing out that wasteful research is very unethical, and that if you want true research integrity, then you must at every point try to reduce waste in research. And there's, sorry, I've nearly finished, but there's one other EU-wide project which we've been involved in. I've been involved on behalf of BMJ, which is the Responsible Research and Innovation Project, which has been running for quite a few years now, including the building of a really lovely big online toolkit, an RRI toolkit, providing all kinds of resources for people to try and ensure that research is of value and that it's addressing questions that matter to people and society.
Okay, wow, that sounds like a lot of initiatives. Just to come back to one point that you mentioned about patient peer reviewers, it seems that you're one of the only journals employing this process, having patients. Why do you think this is the case? Why are other journals not doing it?
Yes, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the BMC journal, but there is a BMC journal which is also including patients. I'm so sorry, I can't think of its name right now. I think it's not a coincidence, because the BMJ has tried to focus on patient partnership in many ways and for many years. So way back in the, I think, late 1990s, we had our first patient editor, and since then we've had 3 or 4 patient editors who have been there to remind us that patients are absolutely central to every part of the scholarly endeavour. Now, what we haven't tried to do is publish information for patients. There are many outlets that do that better than we can. What we're trying to do is make doctors and other health practitioners and researchers who read our journals, we're trying to make them better at their job and to help them to partner with patients. But across the BMJ, we have co-production of our education articles whenever possible. So that means that patients are involved in helping to develop and write the education articles we publish for doctors. And we have this patient review. By the way, we don't call it patient peer review, because peer review means peers, and it tends to mean you're a researcher, we're getting your study assessed by people like you. And of course, we're all human, we all get sick sometimes, we're all patients, but we're quite keen to not call it patient peer review, because we think that kind of confuses things and in some ways dilutes its importance. So we call it patient review. It's a small point, but I think it's quite important.
Yeah, that's really, really important to give patients a voice as well. Yeah. Yeah, okay, Van, do you want to move on with the last question?
Yeah. So, we're just very curious that how you will see the future of scientific journal.
Well, that's a very, very big question, and we've done a lot of work on this over the years, but we're doing a lot right now. So we just published 4 scenarios for the future of scientific research, which of course are seen through the lens of scholarly publishing, and BMJ published those on the BMJ website, not the journal website, but the kind of BMJ company website just a few weeks ago, and that was accompanied by a paper in another journal. But that was looking out at 2030, and that was the result of a big consultation exercise and a lot of workshopping, looking at the rise of things like citizen science, looking at the likely reduction in public funding for research as you know, the sort of global balance changes in terms of which countries are developing fast and which have got money to spare. Political change, which means that, you know, there seems to be a bit of a movement away from public services and public funding, which we find very sad. But, you know, what would that mean for publishing? So there's all that sort of big context of what's going on out there in the world, and very much the idea of not just citizen science, but co-production of research with patients and that kind of thing. Closer to home, and things that are happening right now are very interesting developments, such as the rise of open research platforms. And that doesn't mean somewhere where you put your data. What it means is they're platforms that kind of cut out publishers completely. So a publishing company provides the sort of software and the peer review processes, but a research funder or research institution such as a university says to its researchers, right, we will invite you to publish everything here. It'll be peer review, but we won't be selective. We won't say this isn't interesting enough or good enough. We'll publish everything, obviously with appropriate limitations expressed and all that, if it's not, you know, the best research ever. And we'll provide this service for you for free. So you don't have to pay a journal to publish your open access research. We don't have to pay the journal to publish your open access research, and nobody has to pay to read it. So that's a really interesting development, and Welcome Open Research is the first example of that. But we've also got the Gates Foundation. The EU is just about to put out a detailed tender on a platform like that for all EU funded research across all disciplines, and some institutions are already doing that. Oh, and the African Academy of Sciences has also launched one of these platforms. Very interesting development, and we're intrigued by that, and obviously to some extent threatened by it, but we hope it might be something that we could also help with and get involved in. And it's, you know, it's extremely interesting opportunity and movement. Other things, again, if things like impact factor become less important, what are journals going to do to please authors? So there's a whole piece of work around how we can be better for authors, and that includes things like making it easier for them to submit, and not saying you can't send us your paper until you have formatted all of the figures in this very specific way. You know, trying to make it less burdensome for authors. There's a whole lot of stuff, but ultimately maybe scientific journals will stop publishing research. I mean, that's the sort of you know, the kind of who needs journals question. Maybe journals shouldn't publish research. Maybe they should curate research. Maybe they should say, hey, this has been published over here on this platform. It's really interesting. We've commissioned an editorial. We've commissioned some debate. You know, we've developed some tools that you can use with your patients to discuss this when you're in a consultation with them. You know, maybe that's what medical journals should be doing. Who knows? Just quickly, you asked about scientific journals, and as a publisher we have about 60 clinical journals, but we now also have a basic science journal called BMJ Open Science, which was launched very recently, with an extremely sharp focus on methodology and open science practices and reporting, and very much addressing all the concerns at the moment about the failure of basic science to reproduce, not least because there's been this sort of weird paradigm that it's okay to take 10 rats from the same clone and assume they're identical, which is nonsense, and not use any kind of random sampling for those rats or cells or whatever, and not to use any random when pairing different interventions or different approaches. And so if you're talking about the future of scientific journals, then I hope that the future for basic science journals is that they will actually develop appropriate epidemiological and reporting processes to make sure that that science is as robust and as reproducible as possible.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And you talk about the citizen science. So do you think that citizen science can contribute to the crowdsourcing as the peer review process? Like, I think now that some starting talking about crowdsourcing peer review.
Yes, yes. Well, again, citizen science means lots of different things. So it might mean, hey, here are some pathology samples. We've put them online. Can you please spot the cancer cells? I mean, there's that sort of fascinating crowdsourcing that goes on and has been shown in recent studies to be as effective as pathologists looking at the slides. Or here's some pictures from, you know, our radio telescope. Can you spot the nebulae or whatever it is? Or can you spot the exoplanets? You know, that kind of thing is completely fascinating. So there's that, the sort of many eyes approach of citizen science, which is wonderful. I'm not sure where that fits in with medicine, but clearly there are all sorts of possible paths where that might take us. As you say, crowdsourcing of peer review. There have been studies of this, and this actually has proved pretty difficult. Nature tried a sort of form of community peer review some years ago, and I guess it's not surprisingly, you know, the world doesn't work like that. People aren't sitting around all day with nothing to do thinking, ooh, I wonder if there's a paper I might peer review at Nature. I'll just go along and have a look. You know, people are busy. And already it's difficult enough to fit peer review into a professional and academic career or clinical career. And it's bad enough when journals email you, you know, 3 times a week and say, can you review this paper? And by the way, to do it well, it's going to take you a day. The reality is that that kind of crowdsourced peer review doesn't tend to happen up front, but it does. We think it works post-publication, and as I say, our BMJ rapid responses have been amazing. That's partly because we have put a lot of effort and resource into doing it well, into making it easy to do, but also into pre-moderating every rapid response. We have a rota 364 days a year of senior editors at the BMJ who look at the rapid responses and make sure that they're okay to post. And I think that has made a big difference. And of course, if you have a good body of rapid responses, it encourages others to take part. And we're sad to see that PubMed Commons, which was an attempt to do something very similar on PubMed, is being closed down from April because, you know, you've got however many millions of articles, or thousands anyway, hundreds of thousands of articles there, but only 6,000 responses that have come through PubMed Commons. Anyway, yeah, I can't remember what the question was now. Sorry, I tend to ramble.
No, it's okay. Yeah, I think that you have answered the question already. That was how
Good.
about the future of using crowdsourcing. So I think that's we can go to the last question. That is, what could be your future career path for a young researcher who is interested in scientific publishing?
Well, I think the very first place to start is with peer review. I would urge anybody who is an early career researcher to somehow find the time and develop the skills to be a peer reviewer. It is vital. You know, peer review is an art, not a science, so we mustn't kid ourselves that it's the perfect system, but, you know, all the cliches are that it's the best system we've got. And all the research that's been done over the years has confirmed really that it's the best system we've got, and there are lots of different ways of doing it. But the idea of saying to people, is this okay? What do you think? How does this fit with what you're doing? Is a good system. And actually, I love the idea that when science, in the Enlightenment in Europe, when science was really sort of suddenly exploding, peer review was a live thing. You know, people would do their science in a lecture theatre with an audience there. And Pascal, I think it was Pascal, was it Pascal? Well, a French researcher, gosh, I think it was Pascal, who was doing work on air pressure and temperature, went up to the top of a mountain with lay members. He went up with a priest and somebody else who watched him doing his experiment at the top of the mountain. And peer review, you know, became this thing that was all done behind closed doors, but it's becoming open again with things like open peer review and so on. And I think it's absolutely vital that as a young researcher, you learn how to do it, you contribute, because it's a way of really contributing to the scientific endeavour. You learn a lot from it, and increasingly you will get credit for it. Because of the open peer review and things like Publons, you should absolutely put it on your CV or resume. And as you learn and as you grow, I hope that you bring in younger colleagues as well, and you help them to do it. It's vitally important. So that's the best place to start.
Yeah.
After that, there aren't that many jobs like mine. There are not many journals in the world that have full-time editorial staff, for one thing, and there aren't many that offer internships and opportunities for young researchers to work either full or part-time. Many of our editors are part-time, by the way. But there are some, so it's worth looking out for posts at places like the Lancet, the BMJ, PLOS, BMC, and so on. There are some jobs, but frankly not many. And many clinicians and scientists will find that they won't get as much money in publishing as they would if they stayed in their own career. So that might be a consideration as well. It depends, but in many cases that's so. But what there are many opportunities to work part-time as editors. So, you know, most of our journals are specialist journals where the editor works 1 or 2 days a week and might do that for 3 to 5 years. And they have editorial boards, assistant editors, and so on. So there are many, many, many opportunities to join journals as a very part-time thing. But that's a really important contribution.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot. Really, really appreciate that you took the time to speak to us and share all your experience with us.
Oh, you're welcome.